want to talk about something that's been bothering me for 2 years now. There's a college basketball player who was at Princeton and George Washington who got a lot of media attention because of his personal story, where they said he beat cancer and returned to the court. But the thing is, he never had cancer. And it's not that he lied about it. He's been very open about the fact that he had a non-cancerous condition, but I've been seeing multiple people get this wrong for a long time now, and I'm literally at my last straw. So let's talk about Garrett Johnson and the importance of science communication, specifically accurate science communication. If you don't know me, hi, I'm Nadia. I talk about public health and pop culture, and the purpose of this video is not to shame anybody or call anybody out. It's just to talk about how we can talk about these things more responsibly and why we should. So, some background first. I started my master's at GW in August of 2023, which is also the same semester that Garrett Johnson transferred to GW from Princeton. I believe his first time back on the court was in November 2023, but I didn't catch wind of his story until August 4th, 2024. On that day, GW sent out a newsletter featuring an article that they wrote about him and his medical journey. Essentially, if you don't know, Garrett Johnson was diagnosed with a desmoid tumor in his hip, and that really hindered his mobility and his ability to play basketball. The condition was non-cancerous, but it was very aggressive, requiring a lot of chemotherapy and other treatments to try and address it. I found the article really moving. I remember sending it to my family, being like, I thought this was such a great story, and I'm glad he was able to return to court after going through treatment. And the article is very upfront about the fact that this was a non-cancerous condition. So imagine my surprise when a couple days later, GW sends out another newsletter featuring the same article, except now in the little description underneath the article, they say he beat cancer. And I'm like, you're contradicting your own article, guys. Unfortunately, this would not be the only time that this incorrect connection came up. There was also a post on Johnson's Instagram where the caption on the photo talked about him beating cancer. And I guess somewhere in the post or in the video, it mentioned that the condition was non-cancerous, because there's even someone in the comments saying, wait, I'm confused, doesn't benign mean non-cancerous? The inciting incident for this video was actually an article that came out in GW's student newspaper about Johnson entering the transfer portal, and it repeated the cancer narrative. And this is not a diss of the Hatchet. We love and support student journalism over here, and they're also not the only outlet to do this, and I believe that was the only article I saw that had that problem. But I feel like this just shows how deep this narrative has been ingrained in different places, even though it's not even true. It's even appeared in outlets that have no affiliation to GW or GW students.
The George Washington Revolutionaries are 3-0, but as impressive as they've been on the court, it's a story of one of their student athletes that's really garnering attention.
A ton of excitement on the court and off the court, Jim. And today we're talking about Garrett Johnson. Garrett Johnson is a DMV alum from Oakton, Virginia.
So seeing all this had me wondering, does this impact people's understanding of desmoid tumors? Essentially, what is the broader impact of all of this, if there's any at all? These questions are partially influenced by my own personal experience. I have also dealt with non-cancerous tumors, which is why I gravitated towards Johnson's story in the first place. Having dealt with that and been in cancer spaces, I know that there is overlap between people who have cancer and people who have non-cancerous conditions in terms of our experiences, but ultimately we are still different. And I feel like we lose an opportunity to really talk more about those conditions and get people to understand them. And also from a communication standpoint, I feel like news outlets especially have a responsibility to be accurate in what they're talking about. And I think that there needs to be more understanding of how to talk about science and health conditions in general. This is especially important because research has found that when celebrities talk about their health conditions, specifically cancer, Google searches for those conditions go up. And since college athletes are essentially micro-celebrities, I think this is really important. But ultimately, I am one person, and not everyone thinks the same way that I do, so I decided to talk to some people about this situation and see what their thoughts were. Thinking about this situation also brought up questions about how we've talked about cancer over time and how that has changed, and also just kind of the broader trend of people using cancer as a sort of like reference point to talk about other conditions. And I was just kind of wondering more broadly, basically, what shapes how we communicate and how can we communicate better? So let's see what we find out. Emma Frances Bloomfield is an associate professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, researching science communication and misinformation. To start out, when it comes to public communication, what do you think has the biggest impact on what people retain, especially in relation to like health or science?
That's a really great question because we are bombarded with information from a variety of different sources these days. I think it's hard to say that any one source of information is the most impactful, but we know from surveys that more and more people are getting information about health and science from social media, whether that's from friends and family or by following more reputable sources online. I think social media has become a very important source of information. It's hard to say that anything is the most important, but a lot of people are using social media these days in order to get news or health information.
Is it like volume or like specific like symbols or language that makes people like more likely to retain certain information?
There's a lot of different factors that go into information retention. One bias that people have is that we tend to latch onto the first piece of information that we come across. It's called the anchoring bias. So if you're scrolling on social media and you see a piece of information, let's say about sunscreen, then that becomes an anchor and you're, oh yeah, that's what I believe about this. And then as you keep scrolling, you might see more information that confirms that information, and that's called the confirmation bias. And so you're less likely to seek out information that contradicts that original piece of information. So I think that initial factor, what's the first piece of information you come across, and then how frequently is that being confirmed? Of course, social media is wired to give you what you already engage with. So once you start engaging with a topic, you'll keep getting more information about it. So I think it's a combination of initial impact on a topic, how frequently you see it, and then also what kind of variety of sources are you seeing it from? Are you seeing it from trusted friends and family members? Are you seeing it from, trusted news websites? What's the credibility of that source as well? So I would say it's a combination of those factors.
That makes a ton of sense. And then broadly, what should journalists or communicators or people on social media consider when it comes to approaching talking about certain health conditions in the public eye?
I think the most important thing that people can do is sort of slow down and double check information. I think we are seeing just this kind of fast-paced competition to be the first to get news out there. So slowing down and double checking, verifying. These are practices that journalists do generally, but just making sure that those practices are really tight. Things are being verified, so you're not unwittingly sharing misinformation or false information. For journalists, that's part of their professional practices, but for any of us who are on social media and want to reshare something or post something, we should also be taking those steps to verify that information before we post it. You can verify information by trying to find multiple sources that are supporting that information, doing fact-checked websites, things like that, just to make sure you're not contributing to sharing false information.
Yeah, of course. And then, do you think unintentional errors have the same impact as intentional misinformation when it comes to like comprehension?
Absolutely. Yeah, they tend to have equal weight. In the literature, we call unintentional sharing. So when you share something that you don't know is false, misinformation, but we call intentional sharing disinformation. Misinformation and disinformation, even though the intention and the origin is slightly different, it tends to have similar impacts because people who are absorbing the information don't necessarily know the person's intention, so they just absorb that information as true, or they make a decision about whether to accept it or true or not. So the intentionality might change how someone is sharing the information or where they're posting it or who they're targeting. But the false information itself, no matter its origin, tends to hold equal weight in terms of influencing how people might approach any topic, including a science or health topic.
Yeah, of course. And then with the particular situation that I shared over email, where this student had a non-cancerous condition, but news outlets and like social media, they're talking about it as if it's cancer. Do you think there are any sort of longer term consequences of people taking away an idea about the condition, or would the effects be more limited since like it's a less common condition?
Yeah, I thought that article you shared was really interesting because the original headline talked about the person receiving chemotherapy for their treatment, right? So I think there was this just instant, oh, chemotherapy equals cancer, right? Which is not the case because chemotherapy can treat a variety of different conditions. So I think that's a case where stepping back and double checking and verifying, would have maybe stopped some of those misinterpretations that the condition was cancer. This is a an isolated case, right? A limited case, but it speaks to a larger trend of if you are receiving false information about certain conditions, you are just going to be misinformed about those and potentially could carry those misperceptions to other diseases or conditions as well. So while I wasn't familiar with this particular example, I'm sure people who are reading false information about that condition then might hold those beliefs and might further share them, which would be a problem. But it also just indicates a larger pattern that we all might be consuming information we think is true or we think has been verified, but maybe it still contains falsehoods.
And then to your point about chemotherapy, I was wondering if that's where the disconnect happened as well, since I know chemotherapy is associated with cancer a lot of the time. And it just kind of got me thinking about, I guess, how do we sort of come to associate certain like treatments or certain terms with certain conditions? Because I know the way we've talked about cancer has changed over time, and then a lot of people sort of compare, like if they don't know how to describe a non-cancerous condition, they'll be like, oh, it's kind of like cancer. So I guess how do we sort of like form those associations?
Really great question. Yeah, there's a lot of research out there, especially in psychology, that suggests that that's just how the brain functions, right? There's so much information we have to know. We use cognitive shortcuts to connect certain pieces of information to other pieces of information. So when I learn any new piece of information, my brain is automatically associating it to what I already know. So exactly as you said, that could be a way to explain a new disease. Oh, it's sort of like cancer because you use chemotherapy, but it's different in XYZ ways. But that doesn't stop the brain from still making that association of, oh, this new condition like cancer, right? Which can then get misinterpreted down the line. So it is just sort of a byproduct of the way our brains function is to try to make those connections. But if those connections are too strong or you forget where that connection came from or that the connection is slightly different, you could absolutely absorb some false information and associations. I think chemotherapy is most often used to treat cancer. So that's the association we repeatedly hear, where you're having chemotherapy because you have cancer. And if you don't hear about those other instances as often, then you're not disconnecting, right, those two things in your brain.
I was kind of still formulating the question, but to your point about like those sort of associations that we have and how that can sort of like lead to like confusion down the line, I guess how can we kind of start to like break those, like break down that pathway of like potentially going down the wrong understanding of something?
Yeah, it's really interesting because research would suggest that jumping on those connections or expanding on those connections can be really powerful ways to educate people. So I think it's less about breaking those connections, but maybe expanding on them or emphasizing exceptions to them, or just encouraging people to double check that information and to be aware that those right connections and cognitive biases exist. When I teach in the classroom, I oftentimes try to attach new information to information people already hold, even though the students might not fully grasp right the new concept. It can help them by doing that comparison. So I don't want to leave the impression that that's always a bad thing. But I think that the key is to emphasize those differences, and that the new piece of information expands or is different, in some kind of meaningful way, to help try and break down an association you feel is particularly harmful or isn't useful in the current case.
Bloomfield noted that these lessons extend beyond science and health.
Well, I think the focus on health and scientific topics is incredibly important. It's something that I study in my own research, but a lot of these same biases, cognitive biases, a lot of these same practices of information sharing on social media apply more broadly to other kinds of information, like political information, right? So I think it's just important to think about the mechanisms of online platforms and information sharing and how those are influencing the ways that we communicate and connect to each other writ large. And for health information, that can be extremely impactful because it could influence people's, medical decisions. Yeah.
I'm super grateful to Dr. Bloomfield for taking the time to answer my questions. She's provided a lot of really great insights about how to communicate better and what the potential consequences are of not being accurate in our communication. I also chatted with the Desmoid Tumor Research Foundation back in April, and I tried throughout May to get a on-the-record conversation for this video, but we weren't able to get anything scheduled. I would have loved to feature them, but I will try to represent them the best way they can. The DTRF is a foundation that focuses on research and education around desmoid tumors, which is a condition that Garrett Johnson has. One of their initiatives is the Spread the Word campaign, which aims to inform people about desmoid tumors and address misconceptions. And one of those misconceptions is actually that desmoid tumors are not benign or cancerous. They're actually a third classification. The DTRF believes that this distinction really matters for patients in terms of how they navigate their care and the support they can get. And they're trying to reach the public, but they also specified trying to reach out to doctors and healthcare institutions as well. So there's like layers to health misinformation and getting good information out, because it's like, are you talking to the public? And even if you're not on the internet, what information are you getting in doctors' offices, from people you know, things like that. The DTRF also mentioned in our initial conversation that they don't want to control how patients talk about their own condition. So even though desmoid tumors are not considered benign, they're considered intermediate, they're not going to be like giving weird looks to a patient if they refer to their own tumor as benign. And that kind of raised a question for me of, do we expect patients to be advocates or experts for their own conditions? And I don't think they necessarily have to, but then things get a little bit dicey when they have a lot of eyes on them. I know I've been talking about one person a lot throughout this video, but I think this discussion can be applied very broadly as well. There was an interview that Garrett Johnson did with WJLA in DC where he said something like, if I can be an inspiration for people with cancer, then that's great. And ultimately, I think people who share their health diagnoses really want to connect with others and share how they were impacted and share the kind of help that they received. KFF put out the results of a poll a few weeks ago saying that a lot of people who go to social media for health information are looking for community in addition to immediate information. So they're really looking to connect with people who have their conditions and who might understand them. But that same KFF poll said that most people can't tell whether what they're reading on social media is legit or not. So it's like you want to be able to trust what people are saying about their own conditions, but at the same time, they're not really experts. And so I don't really know what the right answer for that is, but let me know your thoughts in the comments. To close out, I didn't want to end this video without at least giving Garrett Johnson a chance to respond to everything that's been happening. As of mid-April, he has officially transferred to the University of South Florida, so I was able to schedule a phone call with him through their media relations office. Here's that conversation. Thank you so much for making the time. Just to give some context first, I was also a GW student. I was over in the School of Public Health from 2023 to 2025, so kind of some overlap with you. And basically, I'm interested in like how people communicate about health, how they understand health conditions, public health, things like that. And so, like, I was kind of following your story for a while because I had a similar medical journey as well. And I noticed that the way that a lot of people talked about your condition was different from how you talked about it. So I just kind of want to talk to you about what that experience has kind of been like, not so much the actual medical component, but how it has felt to sort of talk about that journey, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So just to start out, when you talk about your health condition, what you experienced, is it common to sort of encounter confusion from other people when you talk about it? And then how do you normally feel in those situations?
Yeah, I would say in my situation, like, I guess maybe a somewhat unique situation where even though I have a benign tumor, I've undergone, like, I guess, typical cancer treatment. So I think people get confused maybe in that sense of, telling them I have a benign tumor, which some people might not even know what that means. And then explain that I've done, however many rounds of chemotherapy over the last 4 years. I think people maybe don't understand that component and then, label it as cancer when they speak about it. I've never said that, I would not label mine as cancer. It's obviously not a cancerous tumor. So I think maybe that's where people get confused. And for me, I would never claim to have cancer knowing, that my tumor can't take my life, the tumor itself. So, yeah, I think that's been kind of a weird journey, I guess, with people not necessarily understanding fully what it is. But, all I do is just try to tell it to the best of my ability to, how it is. And, people come up with their own conceptions after that, I guess. But
Yeah, of course. And then when you're talking on podcasts or talking to blogs, journalists, etc., do you feel that they generally understand what you're telling them, or do you feel that they might not fully understand, or there's room for improvement? Like, generally, what's your perception of that?
yeah, I mean, I feel like when I've had like long form discussions, whether it's like an interview, like a podcast or something like that, that people can kind of understand what I'm saying when I'm able to speak about the full diagnosis, what that means, and kind of the treatment plan I've undergone to try to fix it. But yeah, I think in those senses, people do understand. I think in short-term conversation or people just reading the story online and not even speaking to me is where the confusion comes in and where the mislabeling comes in.
Yeah, of course. And then, in general, what's something that you wish people would know about it that might not necessarily come through?
I think it's interesting. Like, obviously, there's, I think everyone's journey is different and everyone has their own, diagnosis and stuff like this or how they have to treat it. I think just mine's a little unique in just the sense of that, it is a very rare and aggressive tumor, and the placement of it kind of does make, outside of just playing basketball, being able to play basketball is like, it kind of does just make, everyday living pretty painful, I would say, over the course of the last 5 years. Obviously, it's in a better spot now, so I don't deal with some of that too much, but, just people maybe don't understand that, like, when they hear tumor, they think, it's somewhere in your body, just hidden, where people sometimes don't even feel it in some cases, and I think mine is, unique in the sense of, like, where it's at. Being wrapped up in the muscles that it is, it just makes, sitting down, laying down, sleep has been tough since I've had this tumor. Things like that kind of make, on an everyday basis, I'm living with it and feeling it. People probably don't understand that as fully as much. They just kind of see he's done this treatment to play basketball, or he can play basketball now or can't play basketball now. So, yeah, that's kind of a part that I think not a lot of people know.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely get that because I also had a benign tumor, but in a different part of my body, and like it affected my sleep as well. And then it was kind of this weird scenario where I'm trying to explain, like, it has really impacted like my day-to-day life, like because it was like in my chest area, I couldn't really move my arm as much, and so that was just kind of a weird thing to explain to people, where it's like it's impacted my life, but also I'm not gonna die, so
Right. Yeah. Exactly. It's like it's like the little stuff really that people maybe just take, I don't know, for granted, but just like when it's like putting your socks on is a task. It's like a really tough task. It's like stuff like that for me, where just everyday living, like you said, is a little difficult sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. And then, of course, you've been pretty straightforward that the condition is benign, but I know there's also been like social media posts or like blog posts that you've reposted where they describe your condition as cancer. And I know even though you personally would never call it that, sometimes that sort of description of it being cancer sort of gets proliferated. So can you sort of like explain like your thinking, like when those things happen? Like, is it easier to just kind of like share it and not necessarily confront it, or I guess what's happening there?
Yeah, I mean, I know there was one post on my Instagram that someone else had made that was like kind of a slideshow type of post that had said, I think, something along the lines of, Garrett Johnson beats cancer, which, one, it's obviously not cancer. Two, I haven't beaten it, it'll always be there. But, I think in that sense, like I think with that specific post, just going off that, I think it had multiple slides that kind of somewhat told the story where, for me, at least during that time, which I think was, maybe was that 3 years ago, maybe something like that. I think my story was just getting out there as I started playing for GW. Mm-hmm. And for me, obviously, I didn't tell them what to post or consult with them over the post. So when they posted it, kind of was able to tell some of my story, which, I did want to get out there. Just like overcoming, the surgeries, the chemotherapy to be able to play basketball again. And then I was doing really well on the court. So I think I put like some of my stats in there or something. So yeah, I think that was more so my thing is, I'm not going to be able to tell everyone, especially during that time, there's a lot of stories going out. I was doing, just interviews with, ESPN and USA Today and just different sources where my story was starting to get out there, and I was, just kind of excited about that sense that people were going to get to know a little bit. And, if they dug deep enough to know, they would find out, exactly what was going on.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
Thank you for letting me tell some of that for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for making the time. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you found this thought-provoking, interesting, etc. And I hope it gets you to think about how you share health information in your own life.